I always struggle, preaching from well-known texts. I don't know if those of you who have ever done a Bible class or a sermon, I feel like there's more writing on a sermon from a text that people maybe know a little bit more than others. Maybe you're a little bit safer preaching from some obscure text in the Old Testament or something like that, some minor prophet or something. So I approach the battle with David and Goliath with a little bit of trepidation here. But this is the most famous battle that was fought in the Old Testament. And it wasn't between two armies, it was between two men. A shepherd boy named David and a giant named Goliath. And I think to a lot of us, it's such a familiar story that we might actually be deaf to the text because we've heard it so many times before. We might even turn this, if we're not careful, into a pep talk about how we all have to face our Goliaths. You've got a Goliath and I've got a Goliath, and we need to stand up in confidence and have courage. Or maybe it's the bully down the street. Maybe your Goliath is your own poor self-image. That's a joke. That's not what this text is about. Matter of fact, the first time I knew of this story. The first time I actually heard this story was in my high school weight room before the football game when the Talmadge Blue Devils were facing the Wadsworth Grizzlies. I was from Talmadge. Of course, we were David and Wadsworth. Well, they were a big school. They had more of a pool to choose from. They had a pretty mean football team. And the assistant coach, he gave an impassioned speech about how we can defeat this giant. And we lost. So I don't know if his theology was wrong or we didn't have enough faith or something or whatever. But that was the first time I really heard this story. This story, though, is not about self-confidence at all. This story is about the honor of God and the faith that stands up for that honor. You get a clue in the text. Here are some scripture references for you, where this Hebrew verb that means to mock or defy or reproach or deride, it appears 6 times in the text, twice in verse 26, once in a different form there. But whenever you see this in a text, a word that just appears in almost every paragraph, well, that gives you a clue that this is what this chapter is about. The real problem wasn't Goliath's size and his strength, as impressive as it was, but it was his disdain for God's honor. And the real solution was facing that with faith, with trust in God. Well, we're given the geographical setting here with the Philistines on one side of the mountain and Israel on the other, with the valley of Elah in between, verses 1 to 3. And then you come to verse 4 to 7 in the text, and you have, Goliath making quite an impression, right? He's very imposing. He's very large. Depending on how you measure a cubit, anywhere between like 7 and 9.5 feet tall. The guy's ginormous. He's wearing 126 pounds of armor. He's wielding a spear with a 16-pound spearhead attached to it. He's all hairy-chested braggadocio. He's defying Israel's army. And he's yelling out in the morning and in the evening. And he's yelling for this challenger to face him in single combat, leaving Saul, the king, the one who's supposed to be leading Israel and leading by example, well, he's just as dismayed and afraid in verse 11 as the rest of the people. So that's the first 11 verses, and then you come to verse 12, and the scene suddenly shifts to David. And the text follows David from the pasture to the battlefield, verses 12 to 23. Jesse's oldest 3 sons have gone to the battle. Jesse's worried about them, so he sends little David out with some parched grain, some loaves of bread, and some cheese. And, he couldn't have known how much would rest on David going to the battlefield. Yet these seemingly casual events They lead to a critical plot point in the story, in God's story. And this is a wonderful picture, verses 12 to 23, of God's providence in bringing this man after his own heart on the scene and showing you what he's made of and contrasting him with Saul and showing you, like, this is the kind of king that Israel needs. So David shows up, and then you look down in verse 23, and Goliath talked one time too many, and the rest is history. So what does the text teach us about faith? Well, three things. We're just going to condense the text. There's a lot there, but first you see that David's got a very vocal faith, a vocal faith that defends God's armor, or God's honor. Verse 24 to 27, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he's come up to defy Israel. That's the key word again, defy. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. 26, David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach, that's our word again, from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy, the word again, the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. Now what's interesting, if you're just reading along in the book of 1 Samuel, we actually met David in the previous chapter when he was anointed to be the next king in Bethlehem. But these are the very first recorded words of David in the Bible. He doesn't speak in chapter 16. And so we come to hear David's voice with a certain air of expectancy. And his words bring an entirely different perspective to the events in the Valley of Elah. To this point, the narrative has been godless, meaning nobody is talking about God. Nobody is thinking about God. Nobody is trusting in God. But David shows up, he hears Goliath defying the armies of Israel, and he suddenly injects God into this situation, as if he's saying, hey, guys, doesn't serving a living God make a difference here? Doesn't our faith count for something? Goliath had mocked the armies of the living God. Verse 10, Israel's troops, they acknowledge this, that this Philistine, verse 25, he has come and he's defied Israel. But look in verse 26, only David seems concerned enough to turn away this derision, to take away this reproach from Israel. Because David knew that to mock God's people is to mock God himself. Now later on, David is going to repeat the same concern about God's honor to Saul in verse 36. And he's going to repeat again that concern to Goliath on the battlefield in verse 45. But the logic going through David's mind is, if God is so closely identified with his people, and here's a guy shouting reproach upon his people, then do you think God is indifferent toward these slurs against his reputation? Do you think he's going to stand idly by while his name and his people get dragged through the mud? Surely not. So his words challenge the faithless fear around him. Israel sees this giant. David sees a man insulting his God. Israel thought the Philistine was invulnerable, but David just thought of him as what? Uncircumcised. It's a Hebrew pejorative. It's not very nice thing to call somebody. That's the difference, though, that faith makes. When God's honor is our highest concern, it lends an entirely new perspective on our troubles. And it will actually cause us to speak and to act to defend that honor. So what can we learn from verses 24 to 27? Well, faith values God's honor above our own comfort or safety. David was driven by this passion for God's reputation. God's name meant more to David than his own name or his own advantage, even his own security, because that passion drove him to put his life on the line. I'll fight this guy. I'm not going to stand for this. And so David is living out the first line of the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples to pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. To pray that God's name be hallowed. Do we know what that means? It means that we desire, that's the prayer to God, that God, I desire for your name to be treated as holy. And I resolve in my life to act and to speak in ways that will sanctify and exalt your name. That's the prayer. Now, are we driven by that same passion to uphold the honor of God's name? For example, how do we respond when God's character is misrepresented? When someone says, God does not care about human suffering. How can you believe in a God who you say loves you and that he allows all these terrible things to happen? Or when his word is denigrated, when someone says, how could you believe the Bible? The Bible is full of a bunch of contradictions. It's just the word of men that was written down and changed over time. Or when his will is ignored selfishly, when people serve God, may even worship God, but then they live their lives as if to say, well, God's highest priority is my own happiness and comfort. Or when his people are mocked, when people say, Christians, well, they're just a bunch of simple-minded fools. Or when his blessings are not credited to him. When God showers his goodness upon the world and people attribute it to their luck or their hard work or their random chance. In all these cases, the voice of faith is not going to stay silent. The voice of faith is not going to agree with somebody just to avoid conflict. It's going to speak out of concern for God's honor. So that's the first thing. The second thing, we see that David's faith was a vital faith, and that it trusted in God's faithfulness, trusted in God's fidelity. So before David actually makes his way onto the battlefield to face Goliath, he has to face two what we might call mini Goliaths. He's got to face his big brother Eliab and King Saul. And so look at verse 28 to 30. 28 to 30. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption, the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. So we learn here that David's faith faced the contempt of his brother. And, Eliab, he vents in a typical older brother fashion, really belittling David, like, you don't belong here. This is where the adults are. Go back to your few sheep. And then David responds with typical younger brother exasperation. I like the NIV here. Can I even talk? Back in chapter 16, do you remember when Samuel went to Bethlehem to anoint the king, and God said, I'll show you the one I'm going to anoint. And Eliab was the first one to walk out. And what did Samuel think? Surely this is the Lord's anointed. He's tall. He's strong. He looks the part of a king. And God says, no, don't judge by outward appearances. I judge by looking at the heart of things. Well, Eliab, he looks like Saul. He's handsome. He's tall. But here he talks like Goliath. His words of contempt for his little brother are very similar to Goliath's words of contempt later on in the chapter in verse 42. But what I want you to notice about David's faith is David doesn't allow Eliab's scorn to deter him. He simply turns away from his brother in verse 30. His passion for God's honor superseded the sting of the contempt from his brother. He's not going to allow that to stop him from doing what needs to be done. So faith will face contempt. Faith will also face doubt. Let's look down at verse 31. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul. And Saul, sent for David. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." Just utter confidence. I'll fight him. Don't be afraid. He's speaking to the king, by the way, who's doing nothing. Verse 33, Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth. He has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, I struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head, clothed him with a coat of mail, and David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. So here we see that faith is also going to face the doubt of other people. Saul, he insists that David is just too inexperienced, verse 33, and he's under-equipped. So he tries to give him, the coat of armor and the sword and the helmet and all that. He can't possibly win. And so Saul's view of David actually mirrors Goliath's offense at David's weapons. When David shows up and Goliath sees him for the first time, he says, "You're coming at me with sticks? You've brought a knife to a gunfight," in other words. But David's answer, verses 34 to 37, it shows us what gives David such a confident faith, a vital faith, that it dares to go up against Goliath. He explains what sheep have to do with Philistines. A shepherd lives with the constant threat to his flock and his own life. And it wasn't unusual in those days for a lion or a wild bear to make off with one of the sheep. And David is explaining to the king, that's not such an easy job. And if that happened, you know what I did, king? I went after that animal and I struck it down and I forced it to release its prey. And if it turned on me, well, I collared it and I killed it. So the point is, king, you can't say that I don't have any experience fighting. Striking down enemies is part of my job. My enemies just happen to be animals instead of Philistines. But to me, what's the difference? By mocking the living God, Goliath has consigned himself to the lion and bear heap. And he's going to go down just like they did. But this isn't just this brazen confidence here, this baseless confidence. The bottom line is verse 37. David does not ascribe his escapes to luck or even skill and courage alone, though he did have skill and courage. He ascribes it to the Lord. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. What God had done for David in the wilderness of Judah, he's saying, God will do for me in the valley of Elah. Do you see how looking back in faith enabled him to look forward in faith? And that's our application for this section, that faith is sustained in the present only when it remembers what God has done in the past. I think you'll find that to be true. Do you ever find whenever you're in whatever current dilemma that you're in, you're only thinking about what's happening to you in that moment, aren't you? It's like we forget about the past. And what this text teaches us is that in those moments when we're struggling with something, we've got to call to mind the rich history of God's goodness toward us and toward his people in general. For our faith to be living, vital, practical, it has to have both memory, God delivered me back then, and logic. If he handled that, surely he can handle this. And the Bible's full of examples of this. One of them is Psalm 77. Psalm 77 is a psalm of lament for God's people. And they're in a really low condition. The psalm doesn't reveal exactly what they were going through, but the people are really suffering, and they're wondering why, and they're wondering why God seems to have abandoned them, and they're really struggling with their faith to understand what's happening. Why is this happening? Why isn't God answering our prayers? Why are we in this condition? But I want you to notice in verse 10, the psalmist said, "Then I said, I will appeal to this, to the years of the right hand of the Most High." He's looking backward now. He's got out of his little bubble of whatever's happening to him, and he's stopping and he's trying to remember, now what has the Most High God done with his right hand, that symbol of power and strength that he uses to save his people? I will remember the deeds of the Lord. You see how he's willing himself to remember? Yes, I can't see beyond my own nose right now and the struggles I'm going through, but I resolve, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. And Psalm 77 ends in a better place than it started. Now, if this doesn't come naturally to us when we're struggling through or we're facing some sort of dilemma, invest in a diary. Seriously. Start writing down your life and how God is bringing you through certain things. But verse 37 is the key. David's confidence wasn't in his grit. It was in his God. Now, I understand our circumstances are worlds apart from David's. But our God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Whether among sheep or before Philistines or whatever dilemma that you're facing today, faith gains new strength by remembering past deliverances. The third thing and the final thing is David had a victorious faith because it relied on the strength of God. So we finally come to the battle itself, but it lasts all of 2 seconds. First of all, you see verses 41 to 44, this Philistine-centered scene. The Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." So the narrator gives Goliath center stage at the beginning. It's the Philistine this and the Philistine that. The Philistine is mentioned 5 times. He goes, the Philistine looks, he speaks, he curses, he speaks again. Like every loudmouth bully before him, he dominates the scene. He hogs the spotlight. And the writer wants us to feel Israel's fear, wants us to feel that intimidation of Goliath, but also, as a Bible student, wants us to see the man's complete blindness and how his pride and overconfidence have blinded him to the fact that David is not going to fight in a conventional way. And pride, of course, goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. So the Philistine-centered scene gives way to the God-centered speech. Verses 45 to 47, this is the third speech that David gives in the chapter. One in verse 26, when he's talking to the soldiers. Another in verse 34 to 37 when he's talking to the king. And here's another one when he's talking to Goliath. And it's all God-centered stuff. Everything he has to say is about God. Look at verse 45 to 47. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. So David matches Goliath's trash talk, but he's substantiating his words with his faith in the living God. He's boasting that all the earth is going to know about this God who saves without mere weapons. And the aftermath of the battle underscores this. After David strikes down Goliath, when he goes to chop off his head, he has to borrow Goliath's sword, and he doesn't ask for permission. Then you have the battle itself, and it's rather anticlimactic. David's speech, if you were to count the Hebrew words, David's speech contains twice as many words as the fight itself. And after all that anticipation, the knockout blow comes very early in the first round. Verse 48, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. Apparently, this is not like a slingshot. This is like a sling. I should have had a picture of one, but it's like a leather thong with like a little leather pouch in it. You put a stone 2-3 inches in diameter, and these people can wing these things at 150 miles an hour and hit like squirrels and rabbits. That's how good they were. And so David had no intention of fighting the guy on on his terms, did he? He had a plan here. And so then you have the victorious aftermath, verses 50 to 54. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sha'arim as far as Gath and Ekron. Then and the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp, and David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So after David decapitates the champion, the Philistines start to scatter. The Israelites are picking up on this. They gain some courage, and all these people who were dismayed and afraid suddenly have the guts to start pursuing the enemy. They rout them and they plunder them, and they basically mop up. So what can we learn here? Faith trusts that God displays his power through what others dismiss as weak. Faith trusts that God displays his power through what others dismiss as weak. I think we need to hear this over and over and over again. It's all throughout the Bible. Who gave the victory? Was it David? No, David says that the Lord will deliver you into our hand in verse 47. The battle belongs to him. But how did God give the victory? God chose to give the victory to Israel through a person that everyone else saw as weak. All the important people in the story dismiss David. What is Eliab saying in verse 28? Get out of here, you pipsqueak. You're a pain. What are you doing here? Saul does the same thing. You're too inexperienced. You can't possibly win. Goliath says you're puny. And yet God deliberately used this shepherd boy without the right equipment to save Israel. And when he tries to give him the right equipment, what does David do with it? Nah, it's not for me. I'm not going to use that. I'm not going to be a little Goliath. I'm not going to fight Goliath on his own terms. And he's proving here that God delivers without the symbols of human strength. That's what he wanted Israel to see, the way that God saves. What matters most is not that we have the best things, but whether we're serving the living God. And in fact, when you look at your own life, I know we all do this at times. We say, what can I possibly accomplish? Well, your weakness may be the very reason God chooses to work through you. It's the way it always is. Paul said of the apostles, we have this treasure, this wonderful, powerful gospel, this treasure, but we have it in jars of clay, these fragile vessels. to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. And he had this thorn in the flesh he talks about in chapter 12. And so what God teaches him through that suffering is that, hey, I can be content with my weaknesses and my insults and the hardships and persecutions, the calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I'm relying more and more on God. And Scripture continually reminds us of the power of faith over strength that fades, over wealth that vanishes, over status that crumbles. The Psalms say, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. This is a bit like what Craig was talking about in our class. We have our own idols that we serve. The things that we're serving, we're giving ourselves to and trying to find security in and identity in. And over, the Bible is telling us those things they can't save you. They can't deliver you. Psalm 33 says, the king is not saved by his great army. A warrior is not delivered by his great strength. The war horse is a false hope for salvation. And by its great might it cannot rescue. Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope in his steadfast love, that he may deliver their soul from death and keep them alive in famine. Psalm 147, his delight is not in the strength of the horse, nor his pleasure in the legs of man. The Lord takes pleasure in those who fear him, and those who hope in his steadfast love. Now, when you read a text like 1 Samuel, anything about David, it's pointing to Jesus, isn't it, in some way? And time is running out here. But how is this text pointing to Jesus? Well, it's pointing to Jesus because Jesus was the ancestor of David, wasn't he? Born in Bethlehem. Jesus was a lot like David in the sense that he was obscure. He was dismissed. People, belittled him. But Jesus is also unlike David in that he possessed all power. This is what Brent was talking about the Lord's Supper. God and man. And though he possessed all power, he defeated sin and death. He defeated the greatest enemy by embracing weakness on the cross, showing that God's weakness is stronger than human strength, that God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. Think of that. Think of how God defeated death, defeated sin. He did it through what others dismiss as weak. He did it through our Lord. Even the aftermath of the battle here in 1 Samuel 17 points to Jesus. Remember how David was the one who stood up to Goliath. David was the one who severed the head of Goliath. And then what happened to Israel? Well, they were all emboldened to go and fight the enemy and finish the battle. Same with Jesus. Jesus was the one who left heaven, who came to earth. Jesus was the one who stood up to evil and sin and death. Jesus was the one who put his life on the line. And he's the one who's riding forth, as Revelation 19 says, on his war horse. And his robes are drenched in blood. And his people are following him. And yet their robes are pure white, washed in his blood. He's gone. And he's defeated the enemy in principle. He's already dealt the decisive blow to Satan. And yet, what does Paul say? The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. That we get to participate in that victory. So, obviously, the takeaway from 1 Samuel 17 is not to throw rocks at people who mock God's name, doubt his power, dismiss the church. But David does model in principle the kind of faith that honors God. His faith was a vocal faith. Because he valued God's reputation above everything else, he wouldn't allow others to profane his name. David's faith was a vital faith. Because he trusted in God's faithfulness in the past, he was able to face opposition in the present. It was also victorious because he relied on God's strength, not his own. His weaknesses only highlighted God's power. And the same God still works today. So like David, you may feel weak. You may feel unprepared to face the trials you're going to face. You may feel like you're dismissed by the quote-unquote important people of the world. But just remember that God delights in using the seemingly inadequate to accomplish his purpose. And when we stand for his honor, when we remember his goodness, and we rely on his strength, we can face any difficulty in this life. And the God who delivered David will deliver us as well. But just a word of caution, the text does not promise physical deliverance from all suffering. Yes, God delivered David from Goliath, and Daniel from the lion's den, and Peter from prison, but let's not forget the other stories. He allowed James to be executed. He allowed the prophets to be sawn in two, Stephen to be stoned, our Lord to be crucified. So the promise is not that faith will spare us from every trial, but that faith will carry us through those trials to ultimate victory. And you have Jesus telling his apostles this, that I've said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take heart, I've overcome the world. And what is the victory that overcomes the world? Well, that's our faith. That's our faith in Jesus. I hope you've got that faith this week. You're going to need it. It's a cruel world that we live in. And you're going to need that strength and that confidence in God. Maybe you're just now beginning to develop that faith. Maybe you're ready to confess that faith. And you want to be baptized and have your sins washed away, and you're ready to follow the Lord. Well, we can do that for you today. You just let your need be known as we stand up and sing together.